Most muscle cars were built for the people who bought them. They were designed to look good in dealerships, sound good at traffic lights, and make a statement on the street. But this car wasn't built for customers. It was built for war. Because in the late 1960s, Ford found itself in the middle of one of the most intense battles in automotive history. Not a battle for sales, not a battle for popularity, a battle for speed. Every manufacturer wanted the same thing, to cross the finish line first. And as the competition became more desperate, the cars became more extreme. That's when Ford approved something unusual, something most people would never notice at first glance. The Ford Torino Talladega, a car that looked like a muscle car, but was really a racing weapon hiding in plain sight. And the more you learn about it, the harder it becomes to believe Ford actually put it on the road. Most muscle cars from the golden era were born out of a very simple, very American desire to impress the kid next door. They were built for the Friday night cruise, the stoplight drag race, and the showroom floor. They were loud, they were aggressive, and they were designed to make a teenager's heart race fast enough to convince their parents to sign the finance papers. But every now and then, the automotive giants built something else entirely. Cars that weren't meant for the average driver. Cars that weren't even really meant to be sold. Imagine walking into a Ford dealership in the spring of 1969. The showroom is filled with shiny new Mustangs, practical Fairlanes, and family station wagons. But sitting in the corner, there's something that looks just a little bit wrong. The front end looks stretched, almost unnaturally smooth. The bumper looks like it was stolen from another vehicle and flipped upside down. It doesn't have the aggressive gaping grille of a typical muscle car. It feels out of place, almost uncomfortable in its own skin. That car was the Ford Torino Talladega. And the truth is, Ford didn't really want to build it. They didn't build it to win a sales war, and they certainly didn't build it to give the public a comfortable ride. They built it because they were losing a war. A brutal, expensive, and unforgiving war fought on the high-banked asphalt ovals of the American South. How far would Ford go to win? To understand the birth of this bizarre machine, you have to understand the sheer magnitude of NASCAR in the late 1960s. This wasn't just a hobby for weekend warriors. This was a multi-million-dollar battleground where the major American automakers fought for corporate survival. There was a saying back then that governed the entire industry: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. It wasn't just marketing fluff. It was a literal reality. If a Ford Galaxy took the checkered flag at Daytona, Ford dealers across the country would see a massive surge in foot traffic the very next morning. If Dodge won, the Chrysler showrooms were packed. By 1968, the competition had reached a boiling point. The engines were already massive. Everyone had pushing 7 liters of displacement, pushing out ungodly amounts of horsepower that stretched the limits of tire technology. But the engineers were hitting a wall. You could add all the horsepower you wanted, but if the car shaped like a brick, the air would eventually stop it. And this is where things started getting serious. The executives at Dearborn were growing desperate. The Dodge Charger was proving to be a terrifying adversary. The standard Ford fastbacks, while beautiful on the street, were starting to show their weaknesses at speeds north of 150 miles per hour. The air was becoming a physical barrier, a wall of resistance that the mighty Ford WAT-IF could no longer just brute force their way through. Inside the halls of Ford's racing division, the tension was palpable. The high-speed tracks like Daytona and the newly constructed superspeedway in Alabama, a place called Talladega, were demanding something new. They were demanding efficiency. They were demanding a car that could slice through the atmosphere rather than trying to beat it into submission. Looking back now, it's hard to believe Ford actually approved what came next. They were about to embark on a radical, highly controversial project that would push the boundaries of what constituted a production automobile. If you love these deep dives into the forgotten, high-stakes history of motorsport, take a brief moment to hit that like button. It really helps ensure these stories keep being told. Now, to fix their speed problem, Ford couldn't just look under the hood anymore. They had to look at the body itself. They needed a weapon, and they needed it fast. The problem was physics, plain and simple. At 180 miles per hour, air isn't just a gas anymore. It acts like a liquid. It resists every single movement of the vehicle, trapping air underneath the chassis, creating massive lift, and slowing the car down on the long straightaways. Ford's primary weapon in 1968 had been the Torino Fastback, On the street, it was a gorgeous machine, but on the track, it had a massive gaping mouth of a grill that acted like a giant parachute, trapping air inside the engine bay and creating immense aerodynamic drag. To make matters worse, the front bumper was shaped like a giant scoop, pushing air underneath the car and lifting the front tires off the ground. Drivers were complaining that at high speeds, the steering became terrifyingly light. The cars were unstable, unpredictable, and worst of all, they were getting beaten by the competition. Enter a man named Ralph Moody, and the legendary team at Holman Moody, Ford's premier stock car racing partner. They knew that if Ford wanted to stay competitive, they couldn't just rely on the engineers in Detroit who were focused on safety, comfort, and production costs. They needed to think like hot rodders. The mandate was given to create a specialized version of the Torino, a car that would satisfy NASCAR's strict homologation rules, which stated that a manufacturer had to build at least 500 identical copies for the public before the car could be allowed to race. This wasn't about creating a premium product for the consumer. This was about doing the bare minimum required to satisfy the rulebook. The engineers began experimenting with the front end of the Torino. They cut the nose off, literally. They extended the front of the car by about 6 inches, tapering it downward to create a sloped, aerodynamic snout. This wasn't done with fancy computer simulations or advanced wind tunnels. It was done with clay, sheet metal, and intuition. They took the standard grille and moved it forward, flushing it with the rest of the bodywork to prevent air from getting trapped. But the real stroke of genius, and perhaps the most unusual detail on the entire car, involved the front bumper. Designing and manufacturing a completely new, aerodynamic chrome bumper for a limited-run car was incredibly expensive. So, the engineers looked around the shop and found the rear bumper of a 1969 Ford Fairlane. They realized that if they took that rear bumper, cut it into pieces, narrowed it, and flipped it upside down, it formed the perfect aerodynamic air dam. It tucked tightly against the new, elongated nose, directing the air over the hood, rather than letting it slip underneath the chassis. And honestly, that's what makes this car so fascinating. It was a masterpiece of corporate desperation and practical hot rodding. The rocker panels were another area of hidden genius. In NASCAR, the rules stated that the ride height of the car was measured from the bottom of the rocker panels. To get the race car lower to the ground without violating the rulebook, Ford secretly modified the production Talladega models. They rolled the rocker panels upward by an inch. This allowed the race teams to lower the entire chassis by a full inch on the track, while still technically meeting the ride height requirements. It was a blatant, brilliant exploitation of the rules. When you look at the street version of the Talladega, you can see just how rushed the process was. Every single production model was painted in one of only 3 colors: Wimbledon white, royal maroon, or presidential blue. All of them came with a flat black hood and a flat black rear deck lid to reduce glare for the drivers. There were no options. You couldn't get a fancy interior, you couldn't get a tachometer, and you couldn't even choose your wheels. They all came with simple steel wheels and hubcaps. This wasn't really a road car at all. It was a homologation special in its purest form, a race car disguised as a street car, sold to the public only because the sanctioning body forced Ford's hand. By the time the 1969 NASCAR season kicked off, the atmosphere in the garages was tense. Everyone knew what Ford had done. The rumors had been circulating all winter about this strange, long-nosed Torino that was putting up staggering numbers in private testing. When the Talladega arrived at Daytona, it was clear that the sport had changed forever. This was no longer about who could build the best pushrod V8 engine. This was the dawn of the aero wars. The drivers immediately noticed the difference. The Talladega didn't just feel faster, it felt stable. The nose stayed planted to the ground, allowing drivers like David Pearson, Richard Petty, who had shockingly jumped ship from Plymouth to Ford just to drive this car, and Cale Yarborough to carry unbelievable speed through the corners. The air was no longer their enemy. It was working for them. The more you learn about the Talladega, the more unusual it becomes because its success wasn't just measured in trophies. It completely shattered the morale of the competition. Chrysler was caught completely off guard. Their standard Dodge Charger 500, which had also been modified for aerodynamics, was suddenly obsolete before the season even fully got underway. The Talladega was dominating the superspeedways, slicing through the pack with an ease that infuriated the executives in Auburn Hills. At this point, winning had become an obsession. For all the manufacturers involved, the cost was no longer an issue. Millions of dollars were being poured into body modifications, track testing, and factory driver contracts. The racing was fierce, dangerous, and incredibly fast. The speeds were climbing toward the 190-mile-per-hour mark, a threshold that terrified the tire manufacturers and track owners. The bias-ply tires of the era were being pushed to their absolute thermal limits, turning the races into high-stakes games of survival. But Ford's gamble was paying off perfectly. The Talladega was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was reclaiming the crown for Dearborn. David Pearson was putting on a clinic, utilizing the sleek aerodynamics of the Torino to draft past competitors and maintain a stranglehold on the championship standings. Yet, the competition wasn't going to take this lying down. The creation of the Talladega forced Chrysler's hand, triggering a retaliatory strike that would yield some of the most outrageous vehicles ever seen on public roads. The Dodge Charger Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird, with their massive 2-foot-tall rear wings and pointed nose cones, were born as a direct response to the car Ford didn't want to build. The paddock had transformed into an aerospace laboratory. Pit lanes were filled with engineers measuring body seams, adjusting spoiler angles, and debating the fluid dynamics of air traveling over sheet metal. The human element of the drivers was almost overshadowed by the sheer technical audacity of the machines they were piloting. It was a beautiful, chaotic moment in automotive history, a time when the rules were loose enough to allow for true radicalism, and the corporate backing was deep enough to fund it. The success of the Talladega was undeniable. Ford secured the 1969 NASCAR Manufacturers' Championship, and David Pearson took home the Drivers' Championship. The car had accomplished every single goal set by the executives in Dearborn, but the victory came with a heavy cost. The sport was changing, and not necessarily in a direction that the sanctioning body or the manufacturers were comfortable with. The speeds were becoming fundamentally unsafe. At tracks like Talladega Superspeedway, the cars were approaching the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. The tracks weren't designed for those speeds. The safety barriers weren't designed for those speeds, and the human body certainly wasn't designed to survive the impacts that occurred when something went wrong. The drivers themselves were growing uneasy. The legendary tire blowouts of the late 60s were catastrophic events, often sending cars airborne or violently into the retaining walls. NASCAR's founder, Bill France Sr., found himself in a difficult position. He loved the publicity and the massive crowds that the high speeds attracted, but he knew that a single major tragedy could destroy the sport overnight. Furthermore, the factories were starting to realize that this endless cycle of aerodynamic escalation was unsustainable. Building 500 highly specialized, unprofitable streetcars just to qualify a new body shape for the racetrack was an incredibly expensive way to market automobiles. The bean counters in Detroit were looking at the invoices for these aero programs and shaking their heads. By 1970, NASCAR decided that enough was enough. The rulemakers realized that if they didn't step in, the cars would continue to mutate into machines that bore absolutely no resemblance to anything an average consumer could buy. They raised the homologation requirements significantly. No longer could a manufacturer get away with building just 500 cars. Now, they had to build one car for every 2 dealerships in the country, pushing the production requirement up into the thousands. This was the death knell for the extreme aero cars. Ford had developed a successor to the Talladega, the stunning, even more aerodynamic 1970 King Cobra. But when the new rules were announced, the project was instantly canceled. The financial burden of building thousands of those radical machines for the public was simply too much for Ford to justify. The era of the factory-backed aero wars burned incredibly bright, but it burned out incredibly fast. The Talladega had pushed the sport to its absolute limit, acting as the catalyst for a regulatory crackdown that would change the face of stock car racing forever. Today, if you ask the average car enthusiast to name a classic muscle car, you'll hear the same names over and over again: Mustang, Camaro, Charger, G, TO. Rarely will anyone mention the Torino Talladega. It remains a phantom in the history books, a car that performed miracles on the track but somehow slipped through the cracks of popular culture. Part of the reason is its rarity. Only 743 units were ever produced for the street. They were built over a frantic few weeks in early 1969 at the Atlanta assembly plant. And once the quota was met, Ford shut down the line and never looked back. Many of them were bought by people who had no idea what they actually possessed. To the untrained eye, it just looked like a slightly odd Ford fastback with a mismatched hood. Many were driven into the ground, rusted away in backyards, or modified beyond recognition by hot rodders who stripped away the unique factory bodywork. If you appreciate discovering these hidden chapters of car culture, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have a lot more deep dives into the triumphs and failures of automotive history coming up, and your support means everything. Looking back, the Talladega represents a moment in time that will never happen again. A moment when a massive corporate entity like Ford was willing to compromise its assembly lines, alter its production designs, and build a highly impractical vehicle for the sole purpose of winning trophies on Sunday afternoon. It stands as a testament to what happens when engineering and competitive drive are allowed to override corporate caution. The Talladega wasn't built to be comfortable. It wasn't built to be practical or popular or even particularly beautiful. It was built to win. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. Was the Ford Torino Talladega one of the greatest muscle cars ever built, or simply one of the most effective racing tools ever disguised as one? If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, make sure you subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover.